My very first episode of DM Gives Inspiration was about traps and why they are bad. In Season 1, Episode 1, Slides Not Spikes, I talk about how random acts of damage delay story rather than advancing it. But that doesn't mean traps aren't cool. They are absolutely cool. They're a great pop adventure device, a trope seen in many of our favorite films. They can be a hurdle for players that can be satisfying to overcome, if done correctly. So let's revisit that conversation from 2019. Let's talk about using damage-based traps effectively. The Dungeon Master's Guide gives several examples of what triggers a trap. Stepping on a pressure plate, pulling a tripwire, turning a doorknob, inserting the wrong key into a door, entering an area, or touching an object. Basically, anything can trigger a trap if you want it to. There is no absolute rule if players have to use their active perception or their passive perception to notice a trap. Both work, it depends on the DM. Quote, a character actively looking for a trap can attempt a wisdom perception check against the trap's DC. You can also compare the DC to detect the trap with each character's passive wisdom perception to determine whether anyone in the party notices the trap in passing. End quote. So for example, the collapsing roof mechanical trap has a DC of 10. Players would have to roll or have a passive perception over 10 to notice the tripwire. It then goes on to say in the text of the collapsing roof trap that a successful DC 15 dexterity check using Thieves' Tools disables the tripwire harmlessly. A character without Thieves' Tools can attempt this check with disadvantage using any edged weapon or edged tool. On fail, the trap triggers. You can already see the order of operations starting to build for executing this trap, but let's see it to the end first. Any creature in the area beneath the unstable section, of roof in this case, must succeed in a DC 15 dexterity saving throw or take 22 points of bludgeoning damage on average for a failed save, or half that much damage on a successful one. So you can already see that there are several opportunities for players to avoid or reduce this damage. But in order to avoid feeling cheap, or the players feeling cheated, the DM has to be willing to give up the fact that there's a trap in the first place. That DC 10 to spot the tripwire is just the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't necessarily give away the fact that this is a collapsing roof trap. Nor does it mean that spotting the tripwire has ruined your perfect trap scenario. They still have to counter it. And that's where the first big DM mistake is made with traps. Players spot the traps, the DM becomes disappointed, and in their disappointment, it turns into a series of dry, unimagined dice rolls. So let's change that thought process a little bit. Your goal is not to get the players with a hidden trap. You should be willing to declare trap freely. If you are running traps in an area, your players should know about it. It's like a good jump scare in a movie or a video game. You have to build up to it. You have to get the players looking where you want them to. And the longer you draw out that tension, the more rewarding the scare is. So here with our collapsing roof, the players are basically guaranteed to see the tripwire. It's more about the role-playing aspect that comes next. How do they deal with this tripwire? What sort of precautions or countermeasures do they take? There's a throwaway line here at the end of the Dungeon Master Guide's trap section that is so important. You shouldn't allow dice rolling to override clever play and good planning. In this way, traps are opportunities for social engagement, role-play for your players. How are they going to deal with this new challenge you presented them? Now, the book does go on to say, quote, you might call for an intelligence investigation check for a character to deduce what needs to be done, followed by a dexterity check using Thieves' Tools to perform the necessary sabotage. End quote. Again, you don't let those checks just flow into each other without any interaction. If the party has a rogue with Thieves' Tools, then it's an opportunity to focus the camera in on that player and let them have their moment. If they don't have access to this countermeasure, then you let them get creative. You let them stew. This is the part in the horror movie where the violins are really going. They're walking up to the foggy glass, seeing if there's something inside, a bit of movement perhaps. Tell the players how their eyes follow the tripwire, making its way towards a beam, moving up to the roof, which is cracked, leaking water. They're staring down the barrel of 4d10 bludgeoning damage here. It's gotta be a big deal. And when they succeed, if they pass this trap without incident, you haven't dropped that tension. Don't let them relax. And that's where a little bit of DM trickery comes in. If they succeed and get past this trap without incident, there can be another trap, or another monster lying in wait. But if they fail, your jump scare is over. You've spent your investment, and it's time to start from the bottom and ramp that tension up all over again. Change your plan, switch out a trap with a social encounter, give them some time to relax. Let them forget about that damage they just took. Let them enjoy other activities, and then slowly ramp it up again. And this might be personal preference, but when they fail, I like to describe the actions of the trap first before asking for the rolls. Despite the player's best efforts, the tripwire triggers. The pillars buckle. The ceiling rains down. Roll dexterity. Or whatever they may have done. If we have a fighter holding his shield up to protect those underneath him, that's a strength check perhaps. There might be spells that your players have used, or have readied for this situation. The dexterity saving throw is not the only option here. We want a whole range of activities that our players are performing in this moment. But despite that, even after all this setup with the tripwire and telling them about the pillars and the crumbling ceiling, it can still feel cheap because you're gonna deal half damage to them anyway. And some players just aren't very creative in these situations, and many sit back and let other players take the lead when dealing with puzzles of any kind. So if they trigger it blindly or you just don't have very interactive players, I like to add one more little layer here before delivering that damage. An initiative check. And this is something that's seen in the rolling sphere trap, like you would know from Indiana Jones 1981. That particular trap comes with an initiative roll because it has to make its way across the ground. The sphere has to roll. And here with our collapsing roof, we can do that as well. It starts to collapse, and the fast players get a chance to react, now with full knowledge of what they're dealing with, a collapsing roof. That might cause them to make very different choices about how they're going to counter this trap. Change what spell, ability they're going to use, or if they're just going to run away. But this works back into that jump scare. I want my players to succeed here because I want that tension to continue to rise. I am not looking to wear down their hit points or kill them. That's what monsters are for. And this initiative pseudo house rule gives a limitation. Asking your players what they want to do when anything is possible, that's hard for the players to come up with anything. But as the roof is falling, asking them what they want to do, that breeds a creative environment. You can also encourage players to take their turns together if they're before the initiative you've set for the trap, which I usually just put on whatever the DC is for that trap. When it comes to magic traps, you can add in an arcane check to disable in addition to the other trap's requirements. Also, a straight up dispel magic will disable most magical traps. You can enjoy the fact that you took away that spell for the day, but again, the most important part is that you're maintaining that tension. And naturally, players will be more paranoid about upcoming traps. And you might choose to spend that paranoia, that fear, that climax of emotion on the gauntlet. Turning the corner from that hidden trap, they clearly see the swinging scythes and axes and rolling pins, flame jets, spike pits, and all. In our horror movie, the monster is walked into the light. We're in the endgame now. We're not doing jump scares anymore. I do still feel like there are better options for traps than raw damage. Sounding an alarm, causing the players to advance to an area in a dungeon before they're ready, or even just letting them see that outrageous, flaming gauntlet of traps and being able to counter it by questing further in the dungeon or solving some sort of puzzle in the area. But damaging traps can work with that proper pacing and theming. And theming is so important for traps. It gives them a language the players can understand, and greatly reduces their cheapness. Where did these traps come from? Who made them? It's very stereotypical in Dungeons & Dragons that a wizard crafted them. It's magic. It can be anything. That's not very interesting. And when they damage your players, it is cheap. Think about the 1990 movie Home Alone. Kevin, played by Macaulay Culkin, is an 8-year-old. So all of his traps for the burglars are based on things he understands. The weight of paint cans, that nails hurt, that Christmas decorations are sharp and loud, that race cars are slippery. It gets a little weird that he basically creates a flamethrower, but you get the idea. Same thing happens in the 1982 movie Rambo: First Blood. This is a guerrilla military veteran, so of course his traps are going to be more sophisticated, using the nature and land around him, the supplies he has. If that's not your cup of tea, you can think about the 1987 film Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. But these are, of course, survival situations, improvised traps. So in a dungeon, we have to go a little further. Not only who made these traps, but how does the maker get by them? What's their personal countermeasures? Do they have a secret corridor that only they can move along? Do the monsters inside the dungeons, the permanent residents, take advantage of these traps? Do the traps reset themselves? Or do little goblin employees go around every night putting tension back in the wires? Are the traps there to only stop certain invaders? Would there be a language or symbol that friends of the owner of the dungeon would understand, and they could deduce how to avoid these traps? That could be an opportunity to reward a player for an obscure language they know. Can you use your traps to teach something? Like how the poison condition works, and then have poison monsters later on. If the players get hit by a poison trap, now have disadvantage on all attack rolls and ability checks, with that trap triggered, they get a moment to figure out how to counter that condition, go through their spells, their inventory, and see what they can do. Later on in the dungeon, when they're surrounded by poisonous spiders, there's no mystery as to where that venom and poison on the traps came from. It came from these spiders, and they don't want to be bit by these spiders because now they know how bad poison is. And now we have a one-to-one connection. The traps in the dungeon are related to the monsters in the dungeon. And players can associate that frustration they had with that poison trap with the spiders. There's a sweet relief for the players as they kill those spiders, knowing that they've now ruined the chance of those future traps existing. This is how a haunted house works. There might be collapsing shelves, flying books, haunted attack carpets. All those things are very frustrating and cheap. But when they get to beat up the ghost in charge of it all, there's the payoff. There's the release of that tension. Like a good magic trick, the players need to be invested. They need to buy into the trap. They want to be frightened by that jump scare. That's why they walk down the spooky hallway. So sometimes the best trap is not one that stands in the way of the main objective. It's the one guarding the side objective. A plain and clear trap right in front of the money they desperately want. The magic item you know they want. Get them to agree to being trapped first, and the whole thing is going to go a lot smoother. There are many other great movie examples I could give, but we'll end this episode there, and save further discussion for Traps 3.0. Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find more about this show over at kyleferguson.com, 2 S's in Ferguson. This show is supported by the patrons over at patreon.com/KyleFerguson. Music was by Brian Griffith, and I'll see you all next week with episode 7 of season 8, DM Gives Inspiration.